all having a good evening. I'm watching some familiar faces come on, some new ones, so that's great. They're all starting to come in now, so this is great. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started here. I want to be respectful of everybody's time and well, welcome to our now third virtual event here in this quarantine and certainly unprecedented time. We're excited to be with you here this evening to go over legacy planning for retirees. I certainly hope that you and your family, all your loved ones, are healthy and safe. My name is Greg Gordon. I'm a divisional vice president and one of the senior advisors with Prevail. A couple housekeeping items before we just get started here. Some of you may be familiar with Zoom, others of you may not. As it relates to some of the control features here, if you actually look down on your screen, there's a control bar. Some of you, it might be up. You may have to maneuver your mouse, or if you're on a touch screen, touch it so that it populates. You'll notice that we have muted all phones. We've done that just to eliminate background noise, so it's not distracting. I believe you all have some video features. You can turn that video feature off by selecting it. There's a little camera that it looks like, so you can go on there. And if you don't want us to see your faces, you can select that. Otherwise, we love to see your faces. The other aspect is because we've muted the phones, we have enabled the chat feature. And the chat feature will say that, titled on the toolbar, chat. Feel free to add comments. Feel free to ask questions. We're going to be monitoring those. And at the end of the presentation, we'll address that. For whatever reason, from a time perspective, if we can't get to all of them, we're going to be copying that, and we'll certainly get you answers to those questions. And lastly, depending on how your screen is set up, you're going to see a variety of the faces, the videos, or you'll see names of people who've blocked it out. You can actually minimize that. You can just see Bruce or other speakers on there. So again, you feel free to do that so it doesn't impair the vision of the presentation. So for those of you that are not familiar with us, with Prevail, our overall objective is to help individuals and families become in more financial control, to provide peace of mind over uncertainty. And in particular, really helping clients to best protect and insulate wealth during the accumulation years, but also through the distribution years, both for retirement and from an inheritance, from a legacy perspective. And certainly the latter is the focus of the discussion this evening. And so I'm excited to introduce Bruce Gordon to you. Bruce is a 45-year insurance and financial services executive. He finished his executive career as chief marketing officer of a major insurance company, as well as on their board of directors. Over his career, he's developed many financial products, some of which you may have actually owned or still have to this day. He's contributed to publications as a guest author, and he's been consistently asked to speak at industry events throughout his career. Yes, he is also my father, which is also pretty fun. And he brought me into the business about, nearly 20 years ago. But I'm going to go ahead and take credit for bringing him back into the business and out of retirement. There's only so much golf that you can play. And Bruce has really taken a strong interest in legacy planning, and I think that speaks to not only his generation, his demographic, his stage of life that he's in. And when the Secure Act passed last year, he really felt compelled to educate individuals on how to better transfer wealth. So with that, again, I'm excited for you to see the presentation. I want to thank you for your time, and I will turn it over to Bruce.
All right, thanks, Craig. I've called this discussion an outside the box discussion, and I want to let you know I really wasn't trying to be prescient in terms of how we're living our lives these days with this pandemic. But now, having gone through it for a month, as you have, it seems rather appropriate. The to really put this whole discussion into perspective, we need to start talking about families. And I think I could probably speak for everyone on the call here when I say that for each of us, our families are our number one priority. Always have been, always will be. Our concern for their well-being never wanes. In fact, our concerns almost seem to grow larger as we grow older. Perhaps that's as we draw nearer to the time that we might not be around to help them. And of course, helping our kids and grandkids is just part of our DNA. Our conclusion in this often becomes, how are they going to survive without us? And don't you know, our parents and grandparents probably felt the same way. And some of those concerns, though, are really justified, particularly when it comes to future finances. Only now, the expression changes from how are they going to survive without us to how are they going to survive with taxes that high. I've seen the projections, I've seen the rationale. It's downright scary. And if you haven't seen it, I'm going to show a lot of that to you here this afternoon. Because now without us changes to with future tax policies, with future government regulations, with future legislation. And those are really legitimate concerns, and they're concerns that attach themselves not only to our finances, to our kids and stuff, but also to our legacy. And so the question becomes, how are we going to protect it? Will those inheritances now be sufficient, or will they be for naught? Answering some of those questions is the whole purpose of this presentation. As I said, I labeled it an outside-the-box discussion. And I always have a lot of fun with this in front of an audience, because I'll ask them, do they remember the derivation of the term outside the box? I think it stemmed from a puzzle that I used to play as a kid. My generation played as a kid. And the box consisted of 9 dots, like you see on the screen. And the puzzle was, how do you connect all 9 dots with just 4 straight lines without taking your pencil off the paper? And it would drive you crazy until you realized that the only way to do it was to go outside the box. You had to change your perspective by challenging orthodoxy. And of course, the orthodoxy was that the box is sacrosanct. We're all told to color within the lines, that sort of thing. And so I've structured this presentation, and the goal of this is hopefully will change your perspective by challenging some of the orthodoxy that you hold, particularly as it involves a better way to pass on an inheritance, and one that can create substantial enduring value. If at the end of this presentation, your conclusion is, wow, I never knew that, then, at least from my perspective, the goal will have been met. I've structured this in 3 different parts, pretty much. The first is the what, the middle is the why, and last is the solution. And I'll go through a number of solutions, and this is where we really do get outside the box and into some solutions that you might not have ever thought about. A little humor here, I let you know that this whole presentation has been rated for mature audiences. It's intended for retirees. It's not intended to provide legal or tax advice to any particular person on this call, so viewer discretion is advised. I'm retired. I'm nearing retirement. I'm at that age, whatever people would talk about that. What does that mean? I'm going to suggest to you that it's nothing but that point in our lives when the importance of accumulating wealth is subordinated by our desire to utilize that wealth, however so. Go on vacations, buy a new home, whatever. And wealth that we're talking about, what does that mean? Well, it's not some numerical threshold defined by others. I made it or I didn't make it, that sort of thing. Instead, it's whatever amount we individually consider sufficient to free us financially, and proudly so we can focus on things that we want to do, not have to do. And our legacy is forged from that wealth. So protecting it, sustaining it, and preserving it is the whole basis of legacy planning. Our legacy, therefore, is carried on by our beneficiaries, and it's done intangibly. A lot of memories that they have of us, that we were with them when they got those memories, skills that they might have inherited from us, relationships that we may have introduced them to, but also tangibly from all the inherited monies and other physical assets that we give them that I like to call leftovers. And leftovers have always been thought of as the province of estate planning. But I'm going to suggest to you that even more important, it should be the province of legacy planning. Legacy planning is different from estate planning. It's not the end of life stuff. It doesn't involve trusts and wills and lawyers and accountants and that sort of thing. It's activated and fulfilled before our death. And it's multidimensional, both intangible and tangible. We're only going to focus on the tangible side. And it involves planning and managing today, not only for ourselves, but for our beneficiaries, in order to mitigate all of the woulda, coulda, shoulda, what if judgments that you know are going to be made by our beneficiaries, but we won't be around to refute them. So we want to make sure we get as good a report card as possible. So in comparison, estate planning assures that an inheritance is passed on most effectively, but legacy planning assures that there will be, in fact, a valuable inheritance to pass on. The goals of legacy planning, obviously the first one should be we don't want to ever run out of money. We want to stay self-sufficient during retirement. We want to maintain sufficient additional money for discretionary purposes, you might call fun and frolic. But then we also want to preserve as many of these leftovers as possible and assure that they are, in fact, deemed to be valuable and hopefully structured in such a way that they will endure. Our concerns in this is how best do we do this? How best do we preserve and structure without jeopardizing our own retirement needs? How do we mitigate the risk of what I'll call tangible legacy adversaries? And these are economic and market fluctuations. That's pretty important today. We've all been part of that. Government regulations and tax policies. These are all things that we can't control. But if we're to do this right, we have to react to them properly. So let's start with economic and market fluctuations. A big item as we watch what's happening in the market today. As we get older, all the financial advisors correctly tell us that we need to begin to change our investment risk profile. We need to move from a more aggressive growth posture to a more preservation of capital posture. And that, of course, limits volatility, again, critical today, improves predictability of returns so that we can budget properly, and improves liquidity. So if we need extra cash, we can get at it very quickly. I'm going to show you as we go forward here a pretty outside the box idea on this that you might not have thought of. Government regulations. When we retire, we're suddenly inundated with all types of stuff that we haven't had to think about before. Social Security, Medicare Advantage plans, something called a donut hole, Medicare. There's penalties if we do things and penalties if we don't, and penalties if we're too old or too young, and we got deadlines we have to meet, and if we don't, we're penalized even more. It is absolutely exasperating at times. Retirement is supposed to be uncomplicated. And hot off the press right now, as Craig mentioned, is this thing called the Secure Act. It's actually the Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act. I don't know who comes up with these names. There must be a whole department in the federal government somewhere that's all they do. But nonetheless, this Secure Act, the purpose is to increase retirement savings. Pretty noble cause. And what the government wants us to do is to leverage up these deferred retirement accounts, tax-deferred retirement accounts, IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, 457s, whatever. Secure Act does not affect individually owned annuities, but they really want us to take more advantage of these retirement accounts. The problem is this is very much in the news, but the news has nothing to do with all the maybe advantages of this. It all has to do with people claiming that this is just going to ruin their estate plans. And this is putting tax breaks on the chopping block, et cetera, et cetera. So nobody is really focusing on these expanded retirement benefits. These are things like they've extended the time from which we need to start the minimum distributions to age 72. We can put money into a 401k or into an IRA now all the way up to 70 and a half or beyond 70 and a half. So as long as we have earned income, that sort of thing. But everyone instead is focusing on the post-retirement implications. And the concerns there are that this law is absolutely appending all previously constructed estate plans. It has changed completely how we transfer much of our leftover wealth. That's because of the Title IV revenue provisions. There's actually 4 sections in this law. The first, they call them titles. The first 3 have to do with the benefits that you can get. The 4th title here has to do with how is the government anticipating paying for these benefits, the revenue provisions. And the problem is that they have shifted that revenue responsibility to our beneficiaries. And they've done that by eliminating what has been a very popular, very significant major wealth transfer mechanism called the Stretch IRA. The Stretch IRA is, as we leave leftover tax-deferred accounts to our beneficiaries, from which we've been taking required minimum distributions, probably. When these beneficiaries get them, they get to take those required minimum distributions now over their entire lifetime. So if we gave this to a 20-year-old, that could be another 70 years. Just an enormous tax advantage. What this did is it eliminated that. And that is important when you think of what they call the Great Wealth Transfer. You can look this up. You can Google it. There's been a lot of discussion about it in the last year or so. I like to say it's coming to a beneficiary near you, because what it says is that over the next 25 years, 45 million of us retirees are going to transfer potentially $65 trillion to our beneficiaries. 65 trillion. From the Secure Act perspective, that just represents billions of dollars in potential revenue. So is this a concern? Well, let me show you. Here's a $200,000 beneficiary IRA, leftover IRA going to a 20-year-old in this case. We'll assume a 5% investment rate, and that includes investing on the required minimum distributions, and we'll assume this person's in a 25% tax bracket. Under the current law, that 200,000 would grow to 255 after 5 years, up to 530,000 after 20 years. And the tax would only be $5,000 after 5 years and $42,000 after 20 years. But under this new law, that tax bill changes from $5,000 to almost $32,000 in the first 5 years and up to $133,000 after 20 years. Now, where is a 20-year-old going to get $32,000 to pay the tax bill? It's just scary. I'm going to show you an interesting way to mitigate this whole problem. Actually, there's 2 concerns. Yes, you have the Secure Act. That's the changes in the IRA transfer rules. But there's also a big concern over the inevitable changes in the future tax policies. And both of those affect our beneficiaries. So let's look at the tax policies. Our national debt right now is $24 trillion. $24 trillion. When I'm doing this seminar live, I love it because this is my favorite part. I like to go around the room and ask people how long it would take them to count to 24 trillion. And I'll get all kinds of answers. If they counted one number every second, how long would it take them to count it? And there'll be a year, 2 years, whatever. The answer is 761,000 years. 761,000. There's the math. 24 trillion seconds divided into minutes, into hours, into days, and finally years. So if we were to pay off that debt at the rate of $1 a second, it has to be paid off at some point, it would take 761,000 years to do it. All right, let's look maybe a little more realistically. What if we paid it off at the rate of $1,000 a second? It would still take 761 years. And that is much longer than from the 200 years longer or plus from the time Columbus discovered America until today. It's just an enormous, enormous amount of money that is going to have to be repaid. And guess whose shoulders it's going to fall on? Our beneficiaries. When we look at the tax rates, and of course that's how the government is going to pay back that debt, is through taxes. At the end of last year, and I guess it's still fit for this year, the top marginal tax rate was 37%, and that's on any income earned above $510,000. The lowest tax rate we've ever had, top marginal tax rate, was 7% in 1913. It too was on income above $500,000. The highest top marginal tax rate we've had is 94%. And that came down now on anything just over $200,000. And interestingly, in 1963, and I don't know what caused this, but the top marginal tax rate was lowered to 72%, but it only was on all income on over just $44,000. I show you all of this to show that the government has lots of levers that it can pull and twist, a lot of precedent for changing rates in order to pay off those obligations. And in fact, here is a graph that shows the top marginal tax rate going back to 1913 all the way up until today. And you can see it's been all over the lot. And what's interesting is if you layer on the national debt, now these lines don't correlate mathematically, but they do show an interesting thing because it's only been in the last 10 years that our national debt has increased so significantly, but our tax rates have not followed suit. In fact, they've decreased. So the moral here is, does anyone think that our tax rates are not going to increase? Or more importantly, from a legacy perspective, that our beneficiaries will not be in a much worse tax position than we are certainly in today. When we go back to that great wealth transfer, that $65 trillion, if we assume just an average 4% taxable annual earnings on that, that's $2.6 trillion of taxable earnings every year. That means for every 1% in tax rate, that's $26 billion to the federal government. Don't you just know that they're salivating at the possibilities? So these tax policies, is this a problem or an opportunity? Well, from a legacy perspective, it all depends on what kind of leftover assets we bequeath. And there's only three possibilities. They can be they can be taxable, or they can be tax-free. Each of those possibilities is defined by its tax status, but from the government perspective, maybe more importantly, it's defined by its revenue potential. So let's look at the revenue potential. When we look at taxable inheritances, yeah, some of it's taxable. A lot of it would get a step up in basis. That would be good for our beneficiaries, although there's already discussion on the horizon here for eliminating the step up in basis. Much of it is probably capital gains taxed, not ordinary income, but again, there's a lot of discussion going on right now about making those two rates the same. When we look at tax-free, that's pretty remarkable. And there we're talking about no federal, state, or capital gain tax. So municipal bonds don't count because they would only be tax-free if they happen to be issued in the same state that the taxpayer is domiciled. And they're never free of capital gain tax. But when we look at tax deferred, that's, from the government perspective, is where there is tremendous revenue potential. No wonder they're looking at the Secure Act. It's a very popular vehicle. They want us to even take more advantage of it. Much of that's likely to become beneficiary IRAs. In fact, there's thought that it is probably the largest component of the great wealth transfer. All distributions will be taxed at ordinary income. And when we look at the tax rates that are likely to be much higher, the revenue potential, again, is just enormous. And thus, it is the focus of the Secure Act. So what should we do? Well, we ought to move money from the taxable and the tax-deferred buckets into a tax-free bucket. Now, if we move it from a tax-deferred bucket, that's all going to come out taxable. So there's tax implications. We need to do a thorough assessment. Perhaps we ought to be taking it out in little increments so we can control the tax implications every year, but get it over there into a tax-free bucket. Or should we give our beneficiaries their inheritances today? Probably not. We don't know what our own cash needs are going to be. There's a lot of concerns probably over what our beneficiaries would do with the money. We'd like to probably control that money during our retirement because we never know what emergencies we might have, what opportunities might come along that we'd still like to have access to. But the goal should be to put our beneficiaries in the best possible tax position we can for any inherited assets. That means transitioning those leftovers into a tax-free bucket where practical. And there's only two options. The first option is a Roth IRA. Roth IRA. Money in a Roth IRA accumulates tax-free, but you can only put in money into that if you have earned income. And even then, at our age, we're limited to $7,000 a year or the amount of earned income, whichever is less. There's no age restrictions on contributions going into that. Probably the biggest thing we can do is what they call a backdoor Roth, that we can convert from a regular IRA into a Roth IRA. There's tax consequences of that, of course, but we can do that. The only thing we can't put into a Roth IRA are required minimum distributions. I tried it. I know that for a fact. You can't do that. And you have to own a Roth IRA for a minimum of 5 years in order to bequeath it as a beneficiary Roth IRA. Otherwise, it has to be liquidated and simply given out in cash. But from a beneficiary standpoint, it's an excellent bequest. Might not be substantial enough. It might not include all that is coming over to them as an inheritance. But as long as they have it, it continues to accumulate tax-free. Distributions are also tax-free. But distributions can only be paid over a lifetime now if they're bequeathed as a lifetime annuity. Otherwise, they have to be distributed fully after 10 years. There's still no tax consequences, but it has to be back out into the mainstream where I suppose it is going to be taxable from that point on. And that's all part of the Secure Act. So what's the other tax-free option? Well, it's cash value life insurance. Now, I won't suggest for a minute that anyone on this call is in the market necessarily for more life insurance, but you might be in the market for more cash value, because the cash value of cash value life insurance is the most valuable and least understood tax-free bucket option available to anyone. I'm going to show you a very different perspective on this. And I'm going to focus strictly on the cash value. I'm not focusing on the death benefit. And I'll show you how you can leverage this account, not only for yourselves, but most importantly for your beneficiaries, both before and after our death. Cash value life insurance gets its advantages because it enjoys a very unique and protected tax-free status. The cash value grows tax-free. It's actually tax-deferred, but you assume you hold it until death. It's all totally tax-free. Death benefit, of course, is totally tax-free. Most policies today have a provision that allows people to take that death benefit early if they need it for long-term care, and that's also tax-free. And any distributions that come out of it, which can be done at any time, and as long as they're done as a loan and no repayment is ever required, it's also totally tax-free. There's also no restrictions on premium amounts other than what the insurance company might impose. There's no required minimum distributions. In fact, the government doesn't even know you have these policies. And the returns of those cash value are competitive, predictable, and also protected in most states from creditors. And they're always positive, never negative. Wouldn't that be nice in today's world? Now, there are some variable policies out there, but you shouldn't be probably using those in this context. And of course, because it still has a death benefit, at death, that gets leveraged up, so it makes that cash value much larger. If someone once said to me, this is like an enhanced Roth IRA, but with no restrictions, and they're right. Now, I'm going to just quickly ground everybody here. When I talk pure death benefit, we're talking term insurance. Term insurance is designed to expire at the end of whatever the term is, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever. Standard cash value life insurance has been around for eons. It's designed not to expire. And that's the purpose of the cash value, really. Cash value is built to defray the internal costs when we get up into our 80s and 90s, if we're still alive, when it just becomes prohibitive to have these policies. What we're going to do is to flip this entire concept on its head. And we're going to focus only on the cash value for legacy planning purposes, and we're only going to buy as much death benefit as we need in order to meet the government's minimum requirements for the amount of death benefit that's there. The government says, if you want to have all these great tax advantages, it has to be a life insurance policy. And in order to be a life insurance policy, there has to be some death benefit, a risk that the insurance company is taking. But they don't require you to have a lot of that. They say they'll have a ratio based on the cash value as to how much you have to have on that. So that's the only thing we're focused on. So when people think of cash value or any life insurance as an expense item, their focus is typically, I want to buy as much death benefit as I need for the least amount of premium that I can get away with. And that almost always results in term insurance. But if they think of it as an asset class, that's an outside the box perspective. And now we're looking at things like tax preferred, few contribution limits, low risk, competitive returns, low or no volatility, full liquidity, leverageability, protection from creditors. These aren't life insurance terms. These are asset terms. And now the phrase becomes, I want to pay as much premium as I'm permitted and I can afford for the least amount of death benefit that I'm required to have. Does that sound counterintuitive? Probably does. But again, if we know what the rules are and we play by the rules, we can leverage its value. There are numerous product types and providers out there, just hundreds of them. But there's only very few that are specifically designed for and thus excel at not only the cash accumulation that people talk about, but also the income distribution. And they also have the premium structure that we can use to really leverage this to our advantage and other key features. So if you're involved at all in this or interested at all in this, you need to be very careful on the products you select as far as the legacy. For example, if we anticipate that we might like to borrow from that cash value, which I'm sure we certainly would during our retirement, in order to supplement retirement income or whatever we want to do, wouldn't it be nice if the policy provided that if we ever repay that loan, which again, we're not required to do, the insurance company will retroactively credit the cash value with all the dividends or interest that we would have received if we'd never touched the money. Can you imagine a bank doing that? Can you imagine an investment account doing that? Believe it or not, that actually exists in the life insurance world, but only in a few products. However, not all is guaranteed to be gold. Life insurance, because of that risk, requires underwriting. Insurance company needs to assess that death benefit risk, even though it may be small, what they're going to take, and they need to determine a price that they're willing to accept that risk at. That's a problem for us retirees. We're much older. The math doesn't work as well as it did when we were younger inside the policy. And our health situation may be such that we might not even qualify for it. Or if we did, it might be highly rated. But there's a silver lining in this when it comes to legacy planning. And that is that a policy's owner and insured can be two different people. The owner can be us retirees, the benefactors. The insured can be our beneficiaries, the child, grandchild. The advantage there is that they're much younger, typically, much healthier probably. The insurance costs are going to be much lower, which is going to make the cash accumulation grow much more efficiently. But they also get the death benefit now. They may be in the market, just starting out, need some insurance. They can get that death benefit now and not have to pay anything for it, name a beneficiary, but we still control all the cash value. We control all the policy advantages and tax advantages until such time as we'd like to switch ownership and transfer that ownership and control to them. And we can do that before our death or at death, whenever we choose to do it. And likely when that ownership passes, because of the premium structures that we're putting in place, they inherit a fully paid up life insurance policy that the death benefit on which is going to continue to increase for the rest of their lives, and the cash value is going to continue to grow for the rest of their lives, and they'll be able to access all of that totally tax-free. Let me show you an example. Here's where we're transitioning tax-deferred assets into this tax-free bucket. Here's the situation. Steve and Helen are retired. Steve's 66, Helen's 65. 6-year-old grandson, Kevin. They have ample retirement income, but it's heavily invested in tax-deferred instruments. They hope to leave Kevin a valuable inheritance, but they're really concerned now for the Secure Act and the future tax liability that Kevin may have to endure. So what actions could they do? Well, here I'm just showing they could buy a policy on Kevin, maybe just pay $12,000 a year for it. That might just be their required minimum distributions out of that tax-deferred account. And let's just do it for 10 years. So we're repositioning leftover tax-deferred assets over that 10-year period, and either Steve or Helen maintains ownership of it so they can control it. Well, here are the results. From the time Kevin is 6 until he's 15, those 10 years, they put in $120,000, and they transferred all of that from their tax-deferred account now into this bucket. This policy is now paid up. In fact, when Kevin is now 22, maybe that's when he's graduating college, there's $171,000 available to him right there, tax-free. At age 30, maybe that's when the ownership transfers. Maybe that's when Kevin's getting married, buying his first house. There's $263,000 there. Hold it till age 50, there's $771,000. To age 70, there's $2.2 million. Kevin might like to use it eventually for his own retirement. He could take $120,000 a year here I've got it shown for 21 years. That's $2.4 million. And there's still, at age 90, $817,000 available there tax-free. And the death benefit is now increased to $1.6 million. All of which of that is available for long-term care if you should need it, totally tax-free. You want to help your grandchild with college costs? Stop. Don't write that check yet, even if you can afford it. Instead, borrow the needed amount from the cash value of a policy on your grandchild's life, and then when that child graduates, write the check that you wanted to write to repay the policy loan. Now, why would you do that? Well, last August, the Wall Street Journal ran a whole article had a whole section in there devoted to ways grandparents can help pay for college. One of those ways was cash value life insurance. And the reason that's there is that it is the only asset that doesn't count as income or assets on a student's financial aid application. The other things they mentioned were a 529 plan, That counts as student income. Direct payment to the college. They're only voiding there is the annual gift tax exclusions, but it's not refundable, and it does count also as assets or income to the student. So let's look at an example here. We'll continue the family situation here. Kevin is now 18. He's headed to college. Steve and Helen, remember, they stopped paying the insurance premiums back when he was 15 years old. They think they could afford another $20,000 a year to help him out. Probably won't be enough. He's going to need additional financial aid, but they can at least $20,000 a year they'd like to give him. So they could borrow now $20,000 from Kevin's policy for the 4 years, maintain ownership of it until after college, and then repay that loan upon graduation. So here's the numbers. Remember, they paid $120,000 from the time he was 6 to 15, so they've given him essentially part of his inheritance, $120,000. They're now pulling out $80,000 out of the policy to pay for the loan, pay for the college. They're going to repay that loan plus interest when he graduates. So now in total, they have given Kevin $206,000 in total inheritance over that long period of time. But look what happened. Because they repaid that loan, the insurance policy was completely reinstated to what it would have been if they had not taken it out. So that same $262,000 at age 30 is still there, available tax-free. Take the same tax-free income, $2.4 million for the 21 years there from 70 to 90. That same $817,000 at age 90 is there. That same $1.6 million death benefit is there for long-term care. Thanks, Grandma and Grandpa. As far as the Secure Act is concerned, when this thing had just passed the House, was waiting Senate approval, Kiplinger came out with a solution to help mitigate this. And their number one recommendation was cash value life insurance. They could also name a spouse's beneficiary, convert to a Roth IRA, tax consequences, or use a charitable remainder trust. Well, let's look at an example here with that, mitigating the Secure Act. Let's assume Steve dies when Kevin's 30. Steve would have been in his 90s at that point. The cash value of Kevin's policy when he's 30 is, remember, $262,000. And let's assume he inherited a beneficiary IRA, coincidentally, of exactly the same amount, $262,000. Now, he has to deplete that under the Secure Act for 10 years. We'll assume he takes annual distributions on that. And we'll assume a 5% growth rate, including on the required minimum distributions. And we'll assume he's in a 25% tax bracket. Well, under the beneficiary IRA, that $262,000 after tax has grown to $303,000. With the life insurance, same amount starting, is now up to $451,000. After 20 years, it's $425,000 after tax under the beneficiary IRA, but the life insurance is still up to $771,000. Now that's at a 25% tax rate. Okay, we talked about how tax rates have got to go up to pay off the debt and everything. So let's say they double. There's been a lot of examples that have been put forth recently on actually doubling the rate. Say it went up to 50%. Now that $262,000 under the IRA is dropped to $196,000, and after 20 years, it's down to $222,000. But the life insurance policy is still exactly the same, $771,000. The moral of this story: taxes erode value. It's just math. So here's an idea: if you don't need the required minimum distributions from your tax-deferred accounts, why not put them into one of these tax-free buckets? You have to pay tax on it anyway. You're not permitted to put it into a Roth, but you can put it into cash value life insurance. So kind of beginning to wrap this up, the goals we set out, we've now put our beneficiaries in the best possible tax position regarding their inheritable monies, the leftovers, into that tax-free bucket. As you saw, we can create an incredibly valuable inheritance. We can enable those beneficiaries to take and enjoy part of that inheritance today. Not only having the death benefit, paying college costs, etc., but we retain total control over use of the cash values. It's our money until we decide to transfer it. I always like to close up with some humor here. I found this cartoon a while back. Looks like a boss talking to a subordinate. It says, "It's come to my attention that you've been pushing the box and thinking outside the envelope." Or another one I saw the other day, "Cat litter makers look outside the box to cut costs." But seriously, we've all worked hard for our money. We've spent our whole careers doing it. We're proud of what we've accomplished, the nest eggs that we have built. We hope that some of those nest eggs get passed on to our children or our grandchildren. That's what grandparents are supposed to do. It's our legacy. And we hope that maybe some of that will stick around and become part of their legacy. But as you saw, there's trouble out there on the horizon. The national debt actually is $24 trillion now because of all that's gone on. You add on top of that another $70 trillion in entitlement program unfunded liabilities. I didn't mention those before, but they're there. All of that money has to be paid somehow. It's all going to come out of taxes. Can you imagine our beneficiaries being in a 50, 60, 70% tax bracket on all that they earn, putting the monies that they earn on the money that they inherit from us? They're going to receive an enormous amount here, that $65 trillion, the great wealth transfer. So the big question is, how much of that entire legacy is now going to be eroded by these taxes? Well, hopefully, as you saw here, all of that's preventable. Personally, I have spent my entire career in the life insurance business. So I was very fortunate. And in all that time, though, I never focused on life insurance as a transferable asset class. I never really focused on the tax-free bucket. I was primarily interested in the competitive and the relative competitiveness of products from company to company. So when I saw what Prevail is doing, and this is their model, I just had to come back out, accept Craig's offer to get back involved and help spread the word. So hopefully this has given you some food for thought. Hopefully you took away something there. If you'd like more information on this, if you'd like to see your own situation in light of some of this, talk to your Prevail advisor. This is what they do. They do it really well, and they'll take pride in everything that they talk about on this deal. So with that, I'm going to have Craig come back in. I appreciate your time on this, and we will be happy to take your questions. Craig, are you back on?
I am back on. Thank you, Dad. That was good as always, and I hope everybody enjoyed that. A couple questions that came up that were sent to me, and one was, how long has this strategy been around? And it's a great question. I can probably take that if you want me to. We get that a lot. The answer is that it's been around a long, long time. And in fact, if you read the books, I tell about this in another presentation that I give. If you read the book, What Would the Rockefellers Do? This is a foundational principle of how they have built and continue to build generational wealth. Walt Disney, interestingly enough, actually utilized his cash value to start Disney. I don't think it was transferred to him from a legacy product. I think he actually established it, but nonetheless, he utilized it. Interestingly, it's part of major executive benefit plans. Banks, for instance, are one of the largest purchasers of life insurance as it relates to its asset ability, its cash value. So it's been around a long, long time. And I think the follow-up question to that was, could it ever be overturned, which is another great question. And it has been challenged. To answer that, it's been challenged, I believe, 3 times throughout history, the last being in the 80s. And interestingly enough, each time that it had been, any of the new rules that were put in place, new policies were subject to. Old policies we're all subject to the old rules. And of course, what we're talking about is things being grandfathered in, and certainly the government, and anytime there's laws, that's certainly a precedent. So two good questions there that I wanted to clarify. If you've got any additional questions, comments, you see Bruce's email there, contact us, and we'll be happy to answer those. But with that, I just want to thank everybody for their time. I hope that you stay healthy and safe and sane here as we continue to be in this quarantine lockdown. But thanks so much, everybody.